one of my questions for Jess is who pays for all your work? We'll talk about that later. There's not enough money for this stuff in New Zealand. So I decided, okay, I was going to go back and do some study and do some research, and if I could do one thing, what, after all my time in refuge, might make a difference. And I thought, well, teenage boys, let's start there. Let's see if they could help solve it. You know, do they care? You know, should they be involved? So just to kind of recap the problem, I like the description. It's a hidden pandemic. It's massive. It's a massive, massive global problem, and no one knows what to do about it. Globally, 1 in 3 seems bad enough, right? But in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we can take that up to 55% of women who are affected when we include emotional violence, psychological, spiritual, you name it. There's many kinds of creative types of violence, sadly. It costs us $4 to $7 billion per year, and we're a pretty small country. You know, it's a really big problem. Now, it is usually perpetrated by men, but before anyone in the room gets upset, this triggers a lot of people, that statement. Most men are not violent, you know, and that is a really important point to note. Most men are not violent. Most men want to help with this problem, but the violence is generally caused by men. So why is that, you know? And Jess has talked about a lot of the drivers, which is really helpful. So the prevention movement is reasonably new. We only got women's refuges in the 70s. Before that, you were lucky if you got a night in the church, you know, if you were beaten up at home or whatever it was. So since the 60s, really, we've had women, feminists leading awareness campaigns, research policy, all of that good stuff, which has made major advances, but essentially we've got no long-term solutions, really. And, you know, in 2021, and probably the numbers are even worse after the pandemic, it's increasing. You know, it's a massive problem. And to date, we've had a lack of involvement of men and boys in the movement. So now's the time. So again, why focus on teenage boys? Well, first there's been the lack of involvement. Also, I had teenagers living in the house. Someone else said they had teenagers. So I was really interested in all the conversation going on amongst the kids. It's brutal with all this weird language and disgusting language and you name it. It's pretty tough. So if we look at boys, there's 2 ways to look at them. One is part of the problem, the perpetrators. The other is as the solution. So disturbingly, between half and 3/4 of men who ever rape first do so when they're teenagers. So it's a pretty good time to target them. Of course, they're men of the future, so if we get it right for them, we'll start changing the trajectory. And they're responsive to social marketing. You know, they're highly tapped into all kinds of media, and we don't need their permission. Like a lot of people say to me, particularly in refuge, oh, you need to target younger boys. Yeah, we do, but then you have to go through parents or teachers or whatever. This is a direct, fast way, and I wanted fast answers. You know, what could we do that would make change? Secondly, I was really interested in them as part of the solution. And, you know, the research says boys listen to boys. I'll come back to that. They also said the same thing. They're really strongly influenced by peers, and importantly, boys and men stand to gain. You know, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Matt Brown and his work, She Is Not Your Rehab, out in New Zealand, incredible work. He talks a lot about all the trauma, emotional baggage and everything that men are trying to deal with. They don't know how to deal with it. And most importantly, a lot of men who are violent experience violence themselves, and they're not proud of it. They always say they don't want to be violent, and they end up violent. So, you know, we've got to fix this for everybody. It doesn't help anybody. This is a terrible problem across the board. And as Jess has touched on as well, the problem is changing. So it's not a new problem. It's been going on forever. We could get into where it goes back to, but I don't have time for that. But there are new, pervasive and disruptive influences, very apt for the theme of this conference. And Adolescence, the show really focused on the online influences. We talked earlier about the fact that it's bigger than that, but that's good because it's brought it to the surface and created conversation. So I guess I wanted to understand how entrenched these influences were and what part they play in it all. So, you know, we've got this lovely guy, self-proclaimed misogynist, Andrew Tate. You know, very proud of his toxic masculinity, and we've got the manfluencers in the manosphere, with millions and millions of kids, mostly younger teenagers, following him. And I talked to the boys I interviewed a lot about him. That's just hideous. All the digital media, all the new creative forms of abuse, whether it's online stalking, sexting, dick pics, sexual cyberbullying. There's lots of it. and of course the porn with a lot of normalised violence within it, which is where they're learning about sex. So what, I started out on this thesis, and it was talked about earlier about the academic world is all about good research. I come from a practitioner background. I wasn't really that on board with all the academic mumbo jumbo, but I had to sort of follow the process. So we got to an agreement that I was going to look at why it happens in the problem, but I also wanted to co-design messaging that would make a change. I didn't want to just only understand the problem. I wanted to say, well, what are we going to do about it? And how can we involve teenage boys in that? I'll very quickly run through what I learned in a literature review. I could spend hours talking about this as well, but I suppose the first thing is that the line was one of the things I looked at actually, some old work from the line, which is cool, and a few other programs in New Zealand, but there's not a lot of social marketing on this topic. If you go back over the last 30 years of prevention, there's not a lot to review, or some of it hasn't had any academic discourse, like She Is Not Your Rehab hasn't even been written about in the academic world yet. So very quickly, I did find 5 kind of approaches that were common themes across, the literature. Gender transformative change is the way to go in the future, which means kind of this less binary view of gender, getting away from traditional male roles, traditional female. There's a lot of really good up-to-date academic literature about that being the potential for where we need to go. Co-design, which you're probably all familiar with, blurring research and solution generation, particularly effective with boys. And so I looked outside of violence. This is amazing anti-vaping campaign out in New Zealand, Protect Your Breath, really creative, really cool work. But they've created a whole research agency of young people as part of their program. So the young people actually conduct the research, which is really cool. So they've taken co-design to a new level. Boys as agents of change, so really involving them, getting them leading programs. Boys and men as role models, however, I could talk about this one for a long time, only effective if done right and if it's relatable. It can cause more problems when, you get the big burly traditionally masculine guys kind of taking us away from that point number 1 of gender transformative change. But it is kind of the way we know, and it is effective. This is Matt Brown, who leads She Is Not Your Rehab. I heard him speak on Saturday. Actually, amazing role model. And then he managed to get The Rock involved in his campaign. But we've seen it with White Ribbon and other types of social marketing. And lastly, perhaps obvious but very important, emotive and authentic storytelling is really impactful. This is a seatbelt campaign. Of all the boys I talked to, anything shocking is great. They're so desensitized, right? They don't notice most stuff you put in front of them. They're so overwhelmed with content. It's got to be shocking or funny, but also has to be real and relatable. They smell advertising bullshit a mile away. So it's got to connect with them. So in addition to all that, and again, Jess touched on this, the literature review looked at the connection between the norms and the violence, because some people might say, okay, so traditional masculine norms, do they matter? Does it matter if a guy is really competitive or dominant in a relationship? Well, yes, is the short answer. Yes, it does matter. There's a really strong connection between male perpetrators and traditional masculine norms. There's a huge body of research around, men with traditional misogynistic attitudes are more likely to be violent within marriage. Even bullying and homophobic name-calling in middle school can predict future sexual violence perpetration. So there's a really strong link. So this became kind of a fundamental idea to my research. So I put this kind of visual together really to kind of demonstrate this norms continuum. And on one hand, we have what we see as acceptable, what society still often sees as acceptable: derogatory language, competitiveness, physical strength, typical masculine traits. I mean, they're sort of vaguely dropped in. You could change this depending on the subculture you were talking to, but it's a general idea that leads, it's a sort of a slippery slope into sexism and misogyny, where we start seeing power and control in relationships, or people watching maybe really violent porn, things like that, and then the obvious stuff, the illegal violent behaviour, the verbal violence, or the blackmail, or stalking or strangling, or in this country murder. You had all the protests last year. That's pretty horrendous. It's bad here as well as in New Zealand. So I liked this idea of it being a continuum, of kind of visualising it as one thing leading to the other. They're not separate. It's not okay to go around calling women bitches and hoes and sluts like a lot of the young kids do, because it can and often does move across into this other behaviour. So, you know, the academic stuff, the research methodology, was interpretivist, qualitative research paradigm. I did 14 semi-structured interviews, which, according to literature, is enough to get really good data saturation. That developed really good, rich, deep understanding. And then some of the same boys out of that group came into co-design workshops to review existing programs, including the line, and to co-create relevant, effective solutions. In terms of data analysis, I used the Goya methodology, bringing a sort of systematic approach and some rigour, and dozens of codes were reduced down to one conceptual framework, which I'll talk through shortly. So the three research questions, first was pretty simple. You know, what's the status quo? How do boys understand this violence? Do they know about it? Do they know what it is? Do they care? And I guess the first theme that came out is they do know about it and they think it's a terrible problem, terrible. They all think it's, you know, really confronting and uncomfortable, but it's not their problem. Other people do it. Oh, I've heard of someone at school that did it. Oh, yeah, read about it in the news. They don't see it as related to them. Not my business. You know, Hugo, he was really chatty, this kid. They knew it was all on the record. Some of the stuff they said was pretty revealing. But, you know, he said in New Zealand it's famously high, but it's also taboo. We'd rather talk about the rugby. The second theme, big theme that came through is that those unequal gender norms that we see on that continuum I put together are really acceptable. They consider traditional masculinity is totally fine, not linked to all the other problems that are someone else's problems, supposedly. And there were two examples of this. The first, the words providing and protecting came up over and over, and that's an Andrew Tate mantra. He uses that language. So I was talking to this kid, Sebastian, who was actually quite feminist and progressive. But, you know, when I asked him about Tate, he said, oh, men should be like household, Tate says men should be household providers and protectors. I'd agree with protectors. It's good to work hard and look after loved ones. Like, wow, they think we need looking after. Like, yeah, it was good to delve into that and understand that. And the second example was that derogatory language is totally okay to them. They can justify it in all kinds of ways. You know, Hugo again, I honestly don't think anyone I know really means it when they call someone a bitch. When we talk about women, it's just sounding cool. And the language is a lot worse than that a lot of the time. So, you know, it was pretty graphic. They were very open. I heard it all. So then I put this together into one theoretical proposition that essentially there's a norms perception reality gap. Their perception of what's normal and the reality of what's actually causing the problem, you know, there's a gap in the middle that they're not seeing. They don't perceive gendered social norms as this continuum from acceptable norms to illegal behaviour. They just don't see it. So then the second question was, what are all those influences? Oh, 5. Okay, I'll speed up a little bit. What are all the influences that reinforce the norms? Well, the short answer is there's lots and lots of them that keep this perception reality gap in place. And I've broken it down into 4 from micro to macro. First, peers are everything. I keep talking about bros before hoes, a real common expression, that kind of language. You got to be cool for your mates, right? That's everything. Moving up a level, too fast. Pop culture feeds these norms, of course, all the social media platforms, rap music, sexist sports culture was talked about a lot, and of course porn. And this very wise young man, Tom, said it's completely a vessel of violence for women, but some research would say 100% of 14-year-old boys have seen porn, you know, so it's massive. At the next level, we've got ingrained sexist systemic sexism. So that's really at this high level. I mean, this is the patriarchy we're talking about, really. Wider traditional gender norms coming from older generations, dads, teachers, whatever. Often these boys are quite progressive, but they feel quite conflicted because they've got all these other pressures coming down on them. And then, you know, furthermore, this violence gets covered up. So in the school playground, they talk about the bro code, you never rat someone out. And I even prompted one of them. I said, so even if it was rape? Yep. You wouldn't tell anyone. You'd cover it up. And then it got worse, because then I talked to this guy, Tom, who was actually the head boy of a very prominent Wellington school that I won't name. There's not many Kiwis in the room that'd be able to figure it out. But anyway, they were in the news for some pretty bad sexual abuse a few years ago, and I asked him about that. And so, of course, he was working with senior leadership in school. He said it goes beyond protecting your mates, but actually protecting the institutions which hold value in this privilege. He just spilled it all, you know, the stuff that is covered up. I mean, how can they possibly do anything about this problem when all the power and authority that they're getting is endorsing that this stuff's okay? And then the fourth influence is less direct. Boys don't talk. They don't talk to each other about emotions. People don't talk to them. And, you know, we don't really hear from them much. And Hugo summed that up. You're just showing like your real emotions in front of other people. It's just kind of taboo. I'll sometimes have a drunk cry here and there. I have to get it out somehow. But most people don't do that. They've got to be tough, pretending to be macho all day long. Kind of sad, really. Yeah, so the third question is probably more positive. What are we going to do about it? How do they envisage some messages? Well, they were really happy to talk, and they had lots of ideas. So there were two big enablers. The first is, you know, working with boys as agents of change. Boys listen to boys. You know, one of them 100% like the most impactful kind of thing always comes from the other boys. The second enabler was also what I saw in the literature review: entertaining, authentic, emotive messaging is effective. It's got to be cool, creative, captivating, maybe funny or shocking, and highly authentic. So then I explored two ideas. The first, well, they explored actually, so I asked them, thank you, a gender transformative approach, which is kind of what the literature suggests we need to do, redefining a modern man, you know, the stuff you'd kind of imagine we need to do. We need to shift them from these stereotypes. But too much too soon. It really triggered a lot and got a lot of very defensive reactions. Asking them to change or shift their identity was too hard. You know, some of them said that would make them feel castrated. Spencer, he was very, very vocal. He said, you never want to show weakness. Why would I want to show weakness? And I don't want to be brought down to their level. Wow. So we quickly killed that idea. But got to another very exciting idea. So reframing or redefining violence against women was a powerful big idea. So Abe was this really creative, excited kid, and he went, you know, a different strategy could be categorization of this lower level stuff as violence and abuse, like reclassifying, redefining. And this was like this big aha moment when they saw, I didn't show them that continuum, but I sort of started to describe the links, and like, and then they had all these creative ideas. You could do an animation, or you could have the word bitch blowing up in a bomb, and blah, 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 blah. They got really enthusiastic about how that could come to life. They said it didn't make them feel attacked, and it brought them on board. So I guess in conclusion, this led me to a new framework, a framework that aims to close this norms, perception, reality gap about the violence. So the goal is to ultimately end violence by closing this gap. The status quo at the top is that boys don't understand this norms, perception, reality gap. So how do we get from there to there? Well, challenging masculinity didn't work. It hit all these influences that I've termed the blockers in RQ2, you know, all those levels and levels of influences that are stopping them changing the way they behave. So scrap that. And the second idea, you know, it's really going around these blockers. It's not confronting them directly. It's a bit more strategic, saying, well, you know, if we can reframe what violence is that okay? You know, and they liked that, and particularly when other boys deliver the message and it's done in entertaining or authentic ways that they relate to. So this kind of felt like a pretty exciting model, really. Theoretically, adds to literature by drawing attention to this norms continuum and the perception-reality gap that we haven't really seen talked about much. And practically, it's just a positive framework for change-making. So I think there's exciting possibilities there on a more positive note, but I'd love to hear questions. Yeah.
Yep, I love your presentation, not just because you're a fellow Kiwi, which we'll talk about later, but in terms of when you get down to the solutions, because we heard this morning about our obsessive addiction to the problem, you know, how we all root and root rather than challenging self-identity.
That's right.
Or trying to change attitudes about what is a man, or
Yep.
masculinity, and you actually talk about the behaviour of calling out the specific ways that it shows up.
Totally. It's exactly how you treat children, right? Like you don't criticise the person, you criticise the behaviour, or you correct the behaviour. Yeah.
So how far
Yeah.
down the track did we get in this project in that identifying those behaviours that potentially have the biggest A, likely uptake, and B, potential impact on changing
Yeah, well, this is where I've got to, and need to go further. Yeah, need to find the way in to fund it and turn it into a bigger project, or bring other agencies or experts into the problem. Yeah, that's the exciting next stage. Yeah,
Great.
yeah. So if anyone's got any ideas or funding, yeah.
Thanks, Kate. That was such a great presentation and echoes a lot of the things our watch has found in research, not just with young people but adults as well. One of the things we are exploring is the role of empathy first.
Yeah.
Understanding that once men particularly can self-reflect, they're more likely to see various behaviours as relevant and relatable, existing in their world. They're in the
Totally.
Did you explore at all the role of empathy with young men? I wonder if that came up for them.
I guess the whole thing had an empathetic approach in a way, and part of the reason I did that, I mean, I'd call myself a pretty staunch feminist. I once went to a women's refuge hui. Do you know what hui is? Like a meeting. It's a Māori word for a meeting. And it was the most hardcore, old school feminist thing you've ever seen, like a lot of really angry feminists. And that was very anti any involvement from men or bringing men on board. And I could just see it wasn't working. And our refuge was starting to work with couples, and we had a male advocate. So although it's hard, particularly if you've suffered trauma, like for a lot of women in refuge have suffered trauma, it's really hard to trust men. I get it. But if we don't bring empathy and understand what's driving the problems, particularly intergenerational violence, we won't change it. And men need help and support in doing this. So I think that's probably been a fundamental underlying driver, that this, whatever wave of feminism we're in, fourth wave, needs to bring men along too, for everybody. Yeah, so empathy is, I think, critical to this work for everybody involved, really. Yeah. I think at the beginning, actually, when I said that the problem hurts the perpetrators as much as the victims or survivors, really, because they either end up feeling terrible about themselves or the shame, sometimes they end up in jail, their families get broken up. There's no good outcome for anybody. So I think if you look at it that way, we have to empathise, particularly when you understand. I don't know if anyone's read Matt Brown's book. If you're interested in this space, read She Is Not Your Rehab. It's a hard read. It's a really, really hard read. But he goes deep into the trauma he experienced and how he's got himself out of it and all the work he's had to do. And that's what he's encouraging other men to do the work. But, man, you have empathy for, guys in gangs, in prison, whatever, who've ended up violent. You read those stories about what a lot of them have lived through, and, oh, yeah. Yeah. Hi.
I was just fantastic presentation. Quite confronting, like blunt, may I say, but certainly relevant. Would you be looking at also teenage girls and mothers and their understanding? Because essentially at the end of the day, in shaping values, the family is a social institution. It shapes values, models behaviour, vicarious learning. Will you be getting an insight into?
Oh, I'd love to, yeah.
Because this is fantastic, but to get an intimate understanding of the behaviour of these teenage boys, how are their values shaped? Can we influence that value? So there's no discrepancy between, this is the values I uphold, but I'm actually doing something quite different. What causes the discrepancy between what you uphold in terms of your values and then the consequences of your behaviour? Do mothers play a role there? Can they come in?
Yeah, totally. Mothers and teenage girls, absolutely. Yeah,
Yes.
a lot of my inspiration was teenage girls. My daughter was 16 or 17 when I started this, and her and her friends would sit around. The stories, you know, the amount of girls who've been sexually abused in my daughter's friend group.
Absolutely.
Like, that sparked a lot. And they helped me write questions. I got them involved in recruiting boys. So I see it absolutely ultimately being a joint kind of community effort.
Yeah, it'd have to be especially that understanding of values and belief systems.
Yeah,
which
totally.
We carry through the rest of our lives. And
Yeah, totally. I think what I did here, though, I sort of said to myself, okay, I've got one moment to indulge in some full-time research for a little while. What's the one area I think would make the most difference? So I thought I'd start by exploring, could teenage boys make the difference? And I think they can, but then everybody else needs to come along with that. Yeah. How are we doing for time?
I was just about to step up to switch. I think we've got time for one last question.
No? Answered it all. Perfect.